Rebecca Mitchell thought the brutal Dakota winter was her biggest enemy. She was wrong. Her real enemy was the dying man who just collapsed on her doorstep, and the secret her dead husband left buried under the floorboards. The winter of 1876 came in like a snarling wolf. It was the kind of cold that stole the breath from your lungs and froze the hope in your heart. Out on the edge of the Black Hills, Rebecca was trapped. Her cabin was a tiny wooden box in a world of endless, blinding white. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 3 months. Pneumonia, they called it. A quick, merciless sickness that had left her utterly alone, miles from the nearest soul. Supplies were dwindling. The firewood pile was shrinking. Every day the world got smaller, quieter, and colder. She was staring into the fire, watching her future crumble into ash, when a heavy thud hit her door. It wasn't the wind. The wind screamed and howled. This was different. It was a dead weight, heavy, human. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Bears, maybe, driven mad by hunger, or a trapper, lost in the storm. She grabbed Thomas's heavy rifle from above the fireplace. It felt cold and foreign in her hands. She'd only ever fired it at tin cans, never at anything that breathed. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a thin thread in the oppressive silence. Only a groan answered. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing ice, she unbolted the lock and pulled the door open just a crack. The cold slapped her face. What she saw on her threshold made her gasp. It was a man, a Lakota warrior. His face was streaked with ceremonial paint. His buckskin clothes were stiff with frozen blood. A magnificent feathered headdress lay half buried in the snow beside him, marking him as a man of great importance. A chief. Newspapers from Fort Galloway screamed with stories of conflict, broken treaties, bloodshed. Thomas himself had called it the Indian problem. Every instinct, every story she'd ever heard, told her to slam the door. Bolt it, and pray he died before he could bring his people back to her. He groaned again, a pained, desperate sound. His eyes fluttered open, and for a single searing moment, they locked with hers. There was no hate in them, only agony. A wiser woman would have shut the door. A smarter woman would have left him to the winter. But in that moment, looking into the eyes of a dying man, Rebecca Mitchell made a decision that would not just change her life, but uncover a lie that had been buried deeper than any winter snow. She set down the rifle, and with all the strength she had, she dragged the unconscious Lakota chief into her cabin, saving a life that would ultimately put her own in mortal danger. The next few hours were a frantic blur. Rebecca worked by the flickering firelight, her hands shaking as she cut away the man's frozen clothes. The wounds were horrific. A deep gash along his ribs, angry and raw, and a bullet hole clean through his shoulder. Someone had tried to kill him, and they had almost succeeded. She poured her precious medicinal whiskey into the wounds, hissing as the man's body arched in a silent scream of pain, even in his unconscious state. She sterilized her sewing needle in the fire and stitched the gash on his side closed, her neat, practiced stitches looking alien against his dark skin. There was only one bed in the cabin, hers. With a grunt of effort, she heaved him onto it, covering him with every quilt she owned. As she stoked the fire, a question burned in her mind. What was a Lakota chief doing alone, wounded, in the middle of a blizzard? His people moved as one, a tribe, a family. To be alone in this weather was a death sentence, unless he was running from something or someone. Night fell, and a fever took hold of him. He thrashed and mumbled in a language she didn't understand, his skin burning to the touch. She spent the long, dark hours bathing his forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, and fighting a battle against a death that seemed determined to claim her patient. Just before dawn, as the fire burned low, his eyes snapped open. They were no longer clouded with pain. They were sharp, intelligent, and they were fixed right on her. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked her skin. She was alone, miles from help, with a warrior from a people the newspapers called savages. He was weak, yes, but he was still a man, and she was a woman on her own. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the dying embers. He watched her, his gaze intense, assessing. He wasn't looking at her like a man looked at a woman. He was looking at her like a soldier looked at a potential threat or a potential ally. Then, to her utter shock, he spoke, not in his native tongue, but in clear, though halting English. "They are coming for me," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Rebecca froze, the cup of water trembling in her hand. "Who?" she asked, her own voice barely audible. His dark eyes held hers. "The same men who killed your husband." The world tilted on its axis. Rebecca stared at him, convinced the fever was making him delirious. "My husband died of pneumonia," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her. The chief let out a rough, short laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Your husband was a healthier man than I am, and he was a fighter. Sickness did not kill him." Rebecca sank into the chair by the fire, the room suddenly feeling cold, the man's words chilling her more than the winter ever could. It couldn't be true. Thomas was a simple homesteader, a good man. He had no enemies. "My name is Maka," the chief said, pushing himself up on one elbow, his face a mask of determined agony. "Your husband was my friend. We were working together." "Working on what?" Rebecca asked, her mind reeling. "To expose a thief and a murderer," Maka said. "A U.S. Army major named Harrison, the man in charge of Fort Galloway." The name hit her like a physical blow. Major Harrison had been the one to bring her Thomas's belongings. He had expressed his deepest sympathies, his face a picture of solemn grief. He had assured her Thomas had been well liked, a respected man. "Major Harrison runs a rogue unit," Maka explained, his breathing shallow. "They steal Army supplies, sell them to desperate settlers at outrageous prices. And they steal land. Lakota land, protected by treaty. They find ways to drive my people out, or kill them and make it look like an accident, so they can claim the territory for themselves." Rebecca's hands were shaking. Thomas knew about this?" "He did more than know," Maka said, his eyes burning with a fierce light. "He was gathering proof. He kept a ledger, names, dates, transactions, everything Harrison needed to be court-martialed and hanged. It all started to click into place. The long trips Thomas took, claiming he was scouting for trapping lines. The hushed conversations with strangers who sometimes came to the cabin late at night. The way he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. She had thought it was just the stress of frontier life. "The day he died," Maka continued, his voice dropping, "we were supposed to meet. He was going to give me the ledger to take to a more powerful chief, one who had connections to honest men back in Washington. But Harrison and his men found us first." Rebecca could barely breathe. "What happened?" "They ambushed us. Thomas fought like a lion. He gave me time to get away. He told me he'd hidden the ledger where they would never find it. The last I saw him, he was still fighting. Harrison shot him." Maka's gaze was unflinching. "I am sorry, Rebecca. He did not die of sickness. He was murdered." The image of Major Harrison's sympathetic face flashed in her mind, now twisted into a monstrous sneer. He hadn't been delivering condolences. He had been making sure the grieving widow didn't know anything. "They think I have the ledger," Maka said, sinking back against the pillows, his strength failing. "They shot me, but I got away in the storm. They have been hunting me ever since." Suddenly, the isolation of the cabin didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a target. Harrison's men were out there in the snow, hunting, and they had tracked their prey right to her doorstep. "Where did he hide it?" Rebecca whispered, a new cold terror creeping into her veins. "The ledger. Where is it?" Maka shook his head. "He didn't have time to tell me. He only said he put it where the heart of the home is." The heart of the home. Rebecca's eyes darted around the small one-room cabin. It was a simple place, a bed, a table, a few chairs. And in the center of it all, the stone hearth, the fireplace that Thomas had built with his own two hands, stone by painstaking stone, the heart of the home. She scrambled to the fireplace, her hands running over the rough stones. One of them, near the bottom, felt different, looser than the others. She dug her fingers around the edges, pulling with frantic strength. The stone shifted. With a final tug, it came free, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Her hand trembled as she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was a package wrapped tightly and tied with twine. With shaking hands, she unwrapped it. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She had found it, the proof that could get them all killed. And as she stared down at her husband's neat handwriting, a floorboard creaked behind her. She wasn't alone. But it wasn't Maka who had moved. He was still lying in the bed, his eyes wide with alarm. Slowly, Rebecca turned. Standing in the shadows by the door, which was now slightly ajar, was another man, a trapper, dressed in heavy furs, his face hidden by a thick beard and the brim of his hat. Snow was melting off his boots, forming a small puddle on the floor. He must have followed Maka's tracks, seen the light in the window, and slipped inside while she was distracted. "Looks like you found what the Major's been looking for," the trapper rasped, his voice a low growl. He took a step forward, a long, wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand, as if from nowhere. "Now be a good lady," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "and hand it over. The Major doesn't like to be kept waiting." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Rebecca. The cabin, her only sanctuary, had become a trap. The trapper was big, built like an ox, and the knife in his hand glinted in the firelight. Maka was wounded, barely able to sit up. The rifle. The rifle was on the other side of the room, hanging over the fireplace, impossibly far away. The trapper's eyes flicked from the ledger in Rebecca's hands to Maka in the bed. "So this is where you ran to, Chief, hiding behind a woman's skirts." He took another slow, deliberate step. Rebecca's mind raced. There was no escape. He was between her and the door. Fighting was suicide. But Thomas hadn't been a simple homesteader. He'd been a fighter. And he hadn't built this cabin just to be a home. He'd built it to be a defense. He'd once told her, laughing, "Every home needs a few secrets." Her eyes darted to the floor near the hearth, to a specific floorboard that had always been slightly uneven. Thomas had promised to fix it, but he never had. "Please," Rebecca said, her voice trembling, but her eyes locked on the trapper's. "Just take it. Don't hurt us." She held the ledger out, a clear offering. The trapper's grin widened. Greed flashed in his eyes. This was too easy. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched to snatch the book. And in that instant, Rebecca acted. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stomped down, with all her weight, on the edge of that uneven floorboard. It wasn't a mistake. It was a trigger. The board flew up, revealing not a nail to be fixed, but a cleverly hidden iron ring. Thomas hadn't been planning to fix the board. He had been planning to use it. Rebecca dropped the ledger and yanked the ring with both hands. A heavy, dead-bolted section of the wall beside the fireplace, a section that looked like solid wood, swung inward with a low groan, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A secret passage. The trapper, momentarily stunned by the trick, stared at the gaping hole. That moment of hesitation was all Maka needed. With a roar that seemed impossible from a wounded man, Maka launched himself out of the bed. He didn't have a weapon, but he didn't need one. He was a force of nature. He crashed into the trapper, not with strength, but with pure, desperate weight. The two men tumbled to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The trapper was stronger, but Maka was fueled by adrenaline and a warrior's fury. The knife clattered across the floorboards. "The rifle!" Maka yelled, grappling with the much larger man. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She scrambled past the wrestling men, her fingers closing around the cold steel of Thomas's rifle. She fumbled with it, turning, trying to aim, but they were a rolling, writhing mass. She couldn't get a clear shot. The trapper threw Maka off, his greater strength winning out. He scrambled for the knife. Rebecca knew she had only one chance. She wouldn't be able to shoot him in time. She did the one thing he would never expect. She didn't aim the rifle. She swung it. With a desperate scream, she brought the heavy stock of the gun around in a wide arc, putting every ounce of her fear and rage into the blow. It connected with the side of the trapper's head with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed unconscious onto the floor. Silence. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture was overturned. The ledger lay open on the floor. The secret passage gaped like a dark mouth. Rebecca stood, panting, the heavy rifle still in her hands. Her knuckles were white. Maka pushed himself to his feet, clutching his wounded side. his face pale with pain and exertion. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then outside, a new sound cut through the winter quiet. A shout. Then another. The trapper hadn't come alone. Maka grabbed the ledger from the floor. "We have to go. Now," he said, his voice urgent. He looked at Rebecca, his eyes full of a terrible understanding. "They know you're with me. They won't leave you alive." His words hung in the air, a death sentence. Her home was no longer safe. Her life as Rebecca Mitchell, homesteader's widow, was over. She looked from the unconscious man on her floor to the dark unknown passage her husband had built. One led to certain death. The other led to a future she couldn't possibly imagine. "Where does it go?" she asked, her voice steady now, the fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Away from here," Maka said, grabbing her arm. "That's all that matters." Together they plunged into the darkness of the secret passage, the shouts of Harrison's men growing louder behind them. They left the fire burning, the unconscious trapper on the floor, and the life Rebecca had known in ashes. The tunnel was cold and smelled of damp earth. It was a tomb, and maybe, just maybe, it was their salvation. The tunnel was tight and suffocatingly dark. It scraped at their shoulders as they moved, the smell of cold earth filling Rebecca's lungs. Maka was in front, one hand on the rough-hewn wall to guide them, the other clutching the precious ledger. Rebecca followed close behind, the rifle clutched in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Behind them, they could hear the muffled shouts as Harrison's men stormed the cabin. The sounds were terrifyingly close. "Thomas dug this himself?" Rebecca whispered, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Every night, for a month," Maka breathed back, his voice strained. He knew they were closing in. He said if the worst happened, this tunnel would lead to the old creek bed. It's covered by a rockfall, hard to spot. Every step was an agony for Maka. Rebecca could hear his ragged breathing, could almost feel the pain radiating from his wounded side. But he never slowed. He pushed onward with a relentless determination that awed her. After what felt like an eternity, the air changed. It grew colder, sharper. A faint gray light appeared ahead. They had reached the end. Maka pushed aside a heavy curtain of frozen roots and they emerged, blinking, into the muted light of a snow-choked ravine. A massive pile of rocks and fallen trees concealed the tunnel's entrance perfectly. No one would ever find it by chance. Thomas had been clever, cunning, so much more than she had ever known. They were free, but they were far from safe. They stood in a world of gray and white. The blizzard had passed, but the sky was a heavy, oppressive lid of cloud. The cold was brutal, a physical presence that seeped through their clothes. "Which way?" Rebecca asked. Maka scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowed. He was a man in his element, reading the terrain like a map. "They will expect us to run west, towards the mountains, or south, towards the fort. So we go north. North, into the deepest, most unforgiving part of the territory. There is a hidden valley my people sometimes use as a winter sanctuary," Maka explained. "It is hard to find, protected by high ridges. If we can make it there, we will be safe. For a time." It was a desperate gamble. They had few supplies, a single rifle, and Maka was badly wounded. The journey would be grueling, perhaps impossible, but it was their only chance. For 3 days they walked. It was a waking nightmare. The cold was a constant torment. The snow was deep, sometimes up to their waists, and every step was a struggle. They ate little, slept less. They huddled together for warmth during the brief freezing nights, back to back under a rocky outcrop, the rifle between them. Rebecca had never known such exhaustion. Her body screamed in protest, but her mind was sharp, focused. The pampered woman from Philadelphia was gone, burned away by grief and fear and the raw will to survive. She learned to read the signs Maka pointed out, the subtle dip in the snow that might hide a crevasse, the way the trees grew that indicated shelter from the wind. Maka was a ghost, moving on sheer willpower. The trek had reopened his side wound, and a fever was beginning to burn in his eyes again. He pushed himself relentlessly, but Rebecca could see he was fading. On the third night, he collapsed. He was delirious, his skin hot, his words a jumbled mix of Lakota and English. Rebecca dragged him into the meager shelter of a pine grove, her own strength nearly gone. She built a small, smoky fire, knowing the risk of discovery was outweighed by the certainty of freezing to death. She cleaned his wound as best she could with snow and a strip of her own petticoat. It was inflamed, infected. He needed medicine, rest, warmth. He needed a miracle. As she sat beside him, feeding the fire with frozen twigs, despair washed over her. They were going to die out here. Thomas had died fighting, but she was going to be claimed by the cold, a slow, anonymous death. She clutched the ledger to her chest, the proof of her husband's murder. It felt heavy, useless. Then through the swirling snow she saw it, a light, distant, faint, but unmistakable. A flickering yellow light, like a lantern or a campfire. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. Someone was out there. A trapper's cabin, maybe? Another settler? It was a terrible risk. It could be Harrison's men. But staying put was a death sentence for Maka. With a surge of adrenaline, she extinguished her own small fire. She hoisted Maka to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders. He was a dead weight, barely conscious. "Come on, Maka," she grunted, half dragging, half carrying him through the snow. "We're not dying tonight." The journey towards the light was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every step was a battle. The snow seemed to pull at her, the cold clawed at her. But the light grew steadily brighter, a beacon in the frozen darkness. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing. It wasn't a cabin. It was a makeshift camp. In the center, a fire roared, and around the fire were three men. They were not soldiers. They were rough-looking men, dressed in a mix of buckskins and tattered army coats. They had hard faces and harder eyes, and scattered around them were crates and barrels, stamped with the U.S. Army insignia. These weren't settlers. They were the men Harrison was using, the thieves, the murderers. Rebecca froze at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the trees. Her blood ran cold. She had led them from the frying pan directly into the fire. One of the men looked up, his eyes scanning the darkness. He must have seen her, a shadow moving against the snow. "Who's there?" he shouted, grabbing his rifle. Rebecca's heart stopped. She was trapped. But then a new voice cut through the clearing, a voice that was calm, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. "Hold your fire, Zamwaishan," the voice said. A man stepped out from behind a large tent. He was tall, dressed in a fine officer's coat, his face clean-shaven and sharp in the firelight. It was Major Harrison, his eyes cold and gray as a winter sky, locked onto Rebecca. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Mrs. Mitchell, it seems you've saved me the trouble of hunting you down." He looked at the half-conscious Maka leaning on her, his smile turning into a sneer. "And you brought my property with you. Excellent." His gaze wasn't on the ledger. It was fixed on something else, something Rebecca hadn't noticed before. Around Maka's neck, tucked inside his shirt, was a simple leather pouch on a cord, a medicine bag. But Harrison wasn't looking at it with a soldier's eyes. He was looking at it with the raw, naked greed of a treasure hunter. And Rebecca suddenly realized the terrifying truth. The ledger was only part of the story. The real secret, the reason for all this bloodshed, wasn't about land or stolen supplies. It was about whatever was inside that pouch. And Major Harrison would kill anyone and everyone to get it. "Give it to me," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. His men flanked him, rifles raised, their faces grim in the firelight. Rebecca's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The ledger, the proof of Harrison's crimes, was tucked safely inside her coat. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the small leather pouch around Maka's neck. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca said, her voice shaking but defiant. Harrison's smile vanished. "Don't play games with me, Mrs. Mitchell. Your husband was a fool. He thought he could play both sides, the righteous scout and the friend to the savages. But all he really wanted was what was his, what was ours." He pointed a finger at Maka. "That chief is carrying a map, not on paper. It's etched onto a piece of carved stone, a map that leads to the lost golden eagle, a sacred Lakota treasure, so they say, a solid gold idol, big as a man's head, hidden in a cave in the Black Hills. The truth hit Rebecca with the force of a physical blow. Thomas hadn't been trying to expose Harrison for justice. He had been Harrison's partner. They were planning to steal the idol together. The ledger wasn't proof of Harrison's crimes. It was Thomas's insurance policy, his leverage to make sure Harrison didn't cut him out of the deal. Her husband hadn't been a hero. He had been a thief. Thomas got greedy, Harrison sneered. He decided to cut me out. He made a deal with the chief. He was going to help the Lakota hide the idol permanently in exchange for a piece of it. But I found out. I couldn't let that happen. So he had killed him, not for justice, but for gold. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Her husband's memory, his honor, the very foundation of her life here. It was all built on a rotten secret. Macaw stirred against her, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Harrison, and a flicker of understanding and deep betrayal passed across his face. He had trusted Thomas too. Now, Harrison said, his patience gone. The stone. Give it to me. Rebecca looked at the three armed men, at the ruthless officer before her, and at the dying chief leaning on her shoulder. They were cornered. There was no escape. But in her mind she saw Thomas's face. Not the loving husband she remembered, but the face of a liar, a man who had used her, who had used Maca, all for the love of gold. And a cold, hard anger began to burn away her fear. Thomas had started this, but she would be the one to finish it. All right, she said, her voice suddenly calm. She gently lowered Maca to the ground, propping him against a snowbank. She reached for the pouch around his neck. Harrison's eyes gleamed with triumph. His men lowered their rifles slightly. Rebecca's fingers closed around the leather pouch. But she didn't pull it off. Instead, her hand moved past it to the rifle slung over her own back. Thomas's rifle. In one fluid motion, she swung the gun around, cocked the hammer, and fired. She didn't aim for Harrison. He was too far. She aimed for the large oil lantern hanging from a tree branch right above his head. The shot was perfect. The bullet shattered the glass, and flaming oil rained down. It caught on the dry canvas of the tent behind Harrison, which erupted in a whoosh of flame. Chaos. The men yelled, startled, turning towards the fire. Harrison roared in anger and surprise. In that single precious moment of distraction, Rebecca grabbed Maca under the arms and dragged him backwards into the darkness of the trees. "Get them!" Harrison screamed, his face illuminated by the raging fire. Gunshots exploded behind them, bullets splintering the trees around her. Rebecca didn't look back. She plunged deeper into the forest, dragging Maca through the deep snow, fueled by a rage she never knew she possessed. Her husband had betrayed them both. Harrison wanted them dead. The world she had known was gone. All she had left was the dying man beside her, a rifle in her hands, and the terrible, liberating knowledge that she was completely and utterly on her own. The fight for the ledger, for justice, was a sham. This was now a fight for their lives, and the only rule was to survive. They scrambled through the burning camp and into the frozen wilderness, with the devil himself hot on their trail. They ran, a desperate, stumbling flight through the snow-choked forest. The fire behind them cast dancing, monstrous shadows, and the shouts of Harrison's men echoed through the trees. Maca was barely conscious, a dead weight she had to half carry, half drag. Her lungs burned with every icy breath. Her muscles screamed. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. To stop was to die. The fire and the shouting gave them cover, but she knew it wouldn't last. Harrison was a hunter. He would be on their trail as soon as the fire was out. They needed to hide. She saw it ahead, a dark shape against the snow, a massive ancient pine tree, its lower branches weighed down by heavy snow, forming a kind of cave against the trunk. It wasn't much, but it was cover. With the last of her strength, she hauled Maca into the hollow space, collapsing beside him. They were hidden from sight, shrouded in darkness and the thick scent of pine. She pulled snow over their tracks as best she could, her hands numb with cold. Then there was nothing to do but wait and listen. Maca's breathing was shallow, his body shivering violently. The infection from his wound, aggravated by the cold and the exertion, was killing him. Rebecca knew with a certainty that felt like a block of ice in her gut that he wouldn't survive the night without help. She tore another strip from her petticoat and pressed it to his forehead. It was useless. She was helpless. After what seemed like a lifetime, she heard them. Harrison and his men, crashing through the undergrowth. Their lanterns cut swaths of light through the darkness, sweeping tantalizingly close to their hiding spot. Rebecca held her breath, her body rigid. "They went this way," one of the men shouted. "Tracks head north." "Spread out," Harrison commanded, his voice tight with fury. "They can't have gotten far. Find them." The lights moved away, fanning out as the men began their search. For a moment, Rebecca felt a flicker of relief. They had missed them. But then one light stopped. It swung back, slowly, methodically, playing over the area they had just passed. It was Harrison. He was smarter than his men. He knew they would have gone to ground. The beam of light crept closer. It illuminated the branches of their hiding place. Rebecca could see the individual snowflakes caught in the pine needles. Any second now, it would shine through the gaps, revealing them. This was it. The end. She closed her eyes, clutching Thomas's rifle. She would not die begging, but the light never came. Instead, she heard a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. A low growl, deep, guttural, and full of menace. It wasn't human. The beam from Harrison's lantern snapped away from her hiding place, pointing towards the source of the sound. A wolf. No, not one. 3 of them. They had stepped out of the darkness, silent as shadows. Large gray shapes with eyes that glowed yellow in the lantern light. They were gaunt, their ribs showing. They were starving, and they had been drawn by the scent of blood. Maka's blood. "Get back, you damn animals!" one of the men yelled. A shot rang out. One of the wolves yelped and fell. The other 2 didn't run. The scent of fresh blood and the gunshot only seemed to enrage them. The alpha, a huge male with a scarred muzzle, lowered its head in charge. Screams. More gunshots. The chaos was absolute. The hunters had become the hunted. Rebecca watched, frozen in a mixture of terror and disbelief, as Harrison and his men battled the enraged wolves. It was a primal, brutal fight, and it was the distraction she needed. "Now," she whispered, shaking Maka's shoulder. "Maka, we have to move. Now." He didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his breathing dangerously faint. There was no way she could carry him. Not far. Not fast enough. She looked at the fight raging in the near distance. At the wolves driven by winter hunger. At Harrison, driven by greed. They were all beasts fighting in the dark. And then she looked at the pouch around Maka's neck. The map to the golden idol. The cause of all this death. An idea formed in her mind. A terrible, desperate, insane idea. It was their only chance. Leaving Maka hidden in the snow cave, she took the ledger from her coat. It was heavy, solid. She took the hunting knife from Maka's belt. Then, with her heart pounding, she stepped out of the hiding place. She didn't run away from the fight. She ran towards it. She stayed in the shadows, circling the clearing, her eyes fixed on the horses, which were tethered at the edge of the camp, bucking and screaming in terror. One of Harrison's men was down, a wolf at his throat. The other was trying to fend off the alpha male with the butt of his rifle. Harrison himself had shot the second wolf, but not before it had torn a chunk from his leg. He was limping, cursing, trying to reload. They were all distracted. Rebecca reached the horses. They were terrified, their eyes rolling. With swift, brutal slashes of the knife, she cut their reins. Then she fired the rifle into the air. The horses bolted. Freed and panicked, they crashed through the forest, a stampede of pure animal terror. They would run for miles, taking with them Harrison's only means of travel. She wasn't done. She ran to Harrison's pack, the one he had dropped near the fire. She found what she was looking for, a small tin of kerosene for his lantern. She worked frantically, her hands clumsy with cold. She ripped pages from the ledger, Thomas's ledger, the worthless book of lies. She soaked them in kerosene. She created a trail of them, leading away from the camp, away from their hiding place, leading north, deeper into the wilderness. At the end of the trail, she left the ledger itself, propped against a tree, with a leather pouch, the one Harrison so desperately wanted, placed right on top of it. But the pouch was empty. She had taken the stone map and put it back around Maka's neck. In its place, she had filled the pouch with ordinary rocks, heavy enough to feel right. A perfect decoy. Her trap was set. She lit the end of the kerosene-soaked paper trail with a burning branch from the fire. The flame raced away from her, a fuse of fire in the snow, leading Harrison on a wild goose chase. By the time he fought off the last wolf and saw what she had done, she was gone, melted back into the shadows. She had stranded them. She had given them a false trail. She had bought herself time. She stumbled back to the snow cave, her lungs heaving, her body shaking from adrenaline. Maka was still alive. Barely. She had saved them, for now. But she had also declared war. When Harrison realized he'd been tricked, his rage would be terrible. He would come for her. And she still had a dying man and the full, merciless force of a Dakota winter to contend with. She hadn't won. She had just raised the stakes to a level she could have never imagined. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving. The forest was silent, the grisly remains of the night's battle covered by a fresh blanket of snow. Rebecca was cold, exhausted, but alive. A grim sense of triumph hummed through her veins. She had faced the devil and walked away. But her victory was short-lived. Maka was worse. The fever had him in its grip, and his breathing was a faint, shallow rattle. He was dying, and she was out of options. She looked down at the stone clutched in her hand. The map, a small, flat piece of soapstone, cool to the touch. It was covered in intricate carvings, lines and symbols that meant nothing to her. But to Harrison, it was worth more than a man's life. To the Lakota, it was sacred. And right now, to her, it was a death sentence. Unless it could be a cure. The cave, she whispered to the unconscious Maka. Is there medicine there? Healing plants? It was a desperate hope. But the Lakota held this place as sacred. Surely it would hold more than just gold. She had to try. She had to get him there. Looking at the map, she tried to decipher the carvings. It was useless. But then she remembered something Maka had taught her during their first days in the cabin. How to read the land. The sun rises behind the eagle's wing. The river flows from the bear's mouth. The carvings weren't a map in her sense of the word. They were a story. A set of directions based on natural landmarks. She studied the landscape around her. The ridge shaped like a sleeping bear. The 3 tall pines that looked like the feathers of an eagle's wing. She knew the way. Getting Maka there was another ordeal. He was a dead weight, and she was running on fumes. She made a crude travois from pine branches in her own shawl and dragged him, inch by painful inch, through the snow. It took her the rest of the day. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and orange, when she found it. Tucked behind a frozen waterfall was a narrow opening in the rock face, almost invisible. The cave. The air inside was still and cold, but it was a refuge from the wind. She dragged Maka into the darkness. Using her last matches, she lit a torch she had fashioned from a pine branch and pitch. The light flared, revealing the cave's secrets. The walls were covered in ancient paintings. Bison, hunters, spiritual figures. This place was ancient, holy. It pulsed with a quiet power. In the center of the main chamber was a natural rock formation that looked like an altar, and sitting upon it was the lost golden eagle. It was breathtaking. Larger than she'd imagined, it was crafted from pure, shining gold, its eyes made of gleaming black obsidian. It seemed to watch her, ancient and wise. But Rebecca barely gave it a second glance. Her eyes were searching for something else. In a small alcove behind the idol, she found them. Clay pots filled with dried herbs and roots, poultices wrapped in leather. The scent was earthy, medicinal. It was a medicine cache. The cave wasn't just a treasury, it was a pharmacy, a hospital. She worked with a desperate urgency, grinding herbs with a stone, mixing them with melted snow. She recognized some of the plants from her own mother's teachings. Others were strange, unknown. She followed her instincts, creating a paste that she applied to Maka's festering wound and brewing a strong, bitter tea that she forced between his lips. Then there was nothing more she could do. She huddled next to him, sharing her own meager body heat, and prayed. For 2 days she held vigil in the sacred cave. She kept the fire burning. She tended to Maka, whispering to him, urging him to fight. She watched as the fever raged, pushing him to the very brink of death. On the third morning, the fever broke. He woke up slowly, his eyes clear for the first time in days. He looked at her, then at the cave paintings on the walls, and finally at the golden eagle gleaming in the firelight. "You brought me here," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. Rebecca nodded, tears of relief blurring her vision. "I didn't know what else to do." "No one," Maka said, his eyes wide with awe, "has entered this cave in 100 winters. Only the chosen shaman. It is the heart of our people." He looked at her, a white woman from a different world, who had somehow found her way to their most sacred place. "The spirits guided you." But their reunion was cut short. From the mouth of the cave came a sound, the crunch of boots on snow. A silhouette appeared, blocking the entrance. It was Harrison. He was limping, his face was scratched and bruised from his fight with the wolves, and his uniform was torn. But he was alive, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying, triumphant madness. He must have survived the wolf attack, and realizing he'd been tricked, circled back, picking up their trail. His gaze fell upon the golden eagle. A low, hungry sound escaped his lips. "So it's real," he breathed. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." He drew his pistol, the barrel looking black and deadly in the flickering torchlight. "I'll take that now," he said, his eyes fixed on the idol. "And then, I'll take my revenge on both of you." This was the end of the line, trapped in a sacred cave, with a madman holding a gun. Maka was too weak to stand. The rifle was leaning against the far wall, impossibly out of reach. Harrison limped toward the golden idol, his eyes glittering with a feverish greed. The pistol in his hand was steady, pointed directly at Rebecca's heart. "You have been a thorn in my side, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "A surprising one, I'll admit, but your luck has just run out." Rebecca's mind raced. There had to be a way. Thomas had built secrets into their cabin. This cave was 1,000 times older, 1,000 times more important. It had to have secrets of its own. Her eyes darted around the chamber, past the ancient paintings to the altar where the eagle sat. Behind it, in the small alcove where she'd found the medicine, she'd noticed something else. A crack in the rock. A fissure, so narrow a man couldn't fit through. But water could. A small trickle of spring water, no thicker than a thread, was seeping from the crack, running down the wall and disappearing into the sandy floor. Maka saw where she was looking. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "It's a beautiful piece," Harrison said, now standing before the idol, his free hand reaching out to touch the gleaming gold. "A fortune. Enough to make me a king." "You'll never get out of these hills with it," Rebecca said, her voice surprisingly steady. She was stalling for time, trying to think. "The Lakota will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Harrison laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the cave. "What Lakota? A few scattered bands of starving old men and women? Their time is over. This is my time." He turned his back on them for a single second, his attention completely absorbed by the idol. That was her chance. "Now," Maka whispered, his voice barely a breath. Rebecca dove for the ground, scrambling toward the back of the cave. Harrison spun around, startled, and fired. The bullet whistled past her head, ricocheting off the stone wall with a deafening crack. She didn't stop. She reached the alcove, her fingers searching for the small clay pots she had used. She found one, half filled with a fine, dark powder. A mineral pigment, she'd thought, for the cave paintings. But it wasn't pigment. She hurled the pot not at Harrison, but at the torch she had jammed into a crack in the wall. The pot shattered. The powder hit the flames, and the cave exploded in a blinding flash of light and a roar of sound. It was flash powder, a compound of minerals that, when ignited, created a brilliant, disorienting explosion. A shaman's trick, a way to create lightning and thunder indoors to awe the tribe. Harrison screamed, dropping his pistol as he clutched his eyes, temporarily blinded. The explosion had another unforeseen effect. The shock wave vibrated through the rock. The tiny trickle of water coming from the fissure behind the altar suddenly became a gush, then a torrent. The fissure fractured, breaking open under the pressure. A hidden underground river, dammed up for centuries, had been released. Water poured into the cave, cold and black. "This way!" Maka yelled, pointing to a high ledge on the side of the cave. He had found a surge of adrenaline, a final reserve of strength. Rebecca scrambled up the rocks, pulling herself onto the ledge just as the water swirled around her ankles. She reached down and hauled Maka up beside her. Below them, the cave was filling with terrifying speed. Harrison, still blind, was stumbling around, screaming in terror and rage as the icy water rose around his knees, then his waist. "My gold!" he shrieked, groping blindly for the idol. "The eagle!" The current was growing stronger, a powerful, swirling whirlpool in the confined space. It caught Harrison, sweeping him off his feet. He was tossed against the rocks, his head striking the stone altar with a sickening thud. Then the current pulled him under. He disappeared into the churning black water. Rebecca and Maka watched, huddled together on the ledge, as the sacred cave that had been their sanctuary became a watery tomb. The golden eagle, the object of so much greed and death, was submerged, its gleam vanishing beneath the surface. The water continued to rise, lapping at the edge of their refuge. The main entrance was completely submerged. They were trapped. "Is there another way out?" Rebecca cried over the roar of the water. Maka pointed toward the back of the cave, to the very fissure from which the river was now pouring. "That water comes from somewhere. It must have an exit." It was a terrifying gamble, to plunge into that dark, unknown torrent, but it was their only hope. They took a deep breath, clasped hands, and threw themselves into the churning river. The cold was a shock, stealing the air from her lungs. The current was a monster, pulling her down, tumbling her over and over in the darkness. She held on to Maka's hand, her only anchor in the chaos. It was a maelstrom, a journey through the heart of the earth. Just when she thought her lungs would burst, she saw a faint glimmer of light. With a final desperate kick, they broke the surface, gasping, choking, into the blinding light of day. They had been spit out of the mountainside into a calm, clear pool, miles from where they had entered. They were alive, battered, bruised, and frozen, but alive. They crawled onto the bank, collapsing in the snow, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Harrison was gone. The golden eagle was lost forever, protected by the river. The ledger, the lies, the greed, it had all been washed away. As Rebecca lay there, staring up at the vast Dakota sky, she knew her old life was well and truly over. The woman who had arrived in this territory was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged in fire and ice. A week later, Rebecca stood on a ridge overlooking a sprawling Lakota winter camp. Beside her stood Maka, weak but recovering, his people having found them and nursed him back to health. He had told his people the story of the white woman who saved his life, who fought beside him, who faced down murderers and wolves, and who protected the sacred heart of their people. He was a chief again, and she was something else. "You have a place here if you want it," Maka said quietly. "You have proven your heart. You would be honored among us." Rebecca looked at the bustling camp, at the families, the children, the sense of community. Then she looked back at the empty, snow-covered wilderness from which she had come. The world of lies and greed her husband had represented. Her choice was clear. "I think," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in months, "I'm finally home." The path ahead would be a strange and difficult one. But for the first time since coming to this unforgiving land, Rebecca Mitchell wasn't afraid. She had faced the winter, and she had won. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. We post stories just like this, full of twists, turns, and unbelievable tales of survival, every single week. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were Rebecca? I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.